What? 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 What is your motion design missing? I'm going to tell you the mistakes you're making so that you can become the dopest motion graphics artist that ever motioned graphics. Mistake number one is not placing enough importance on the actual design aspect of motion design. I can't tell you how many juniors I've seen or new motion graphics artists, inexperienced motion designers who obviously can import a bunch of shit into After Effects and put in some keyframes and make shit move, but you can see that they've paid literally zero attention to the actual design aspect of the motion design. You can see that there's been no thought put into composition. There's no color palette or look and feel developed. It's literally just a bunch of random elements that they brought in and dropped into a composition and made move. Now, if you want to call yourself a motion designer or a motion graphics artist, your stuff needs to look appealing. Think about the design component because it's not going to be successful if you've paid no attention to the actual design side of it, if you haven't planned out the visual treatment as well as the movement, the animation. It's the foundation of your motion graphics house, and it's all going to fall down if you don't pay attention to that foundation. It's not going to look good if you haven't actually thought about the design. Work on your design skills. Learn about color, composition, shape language, and staging. It's super important to have good design. You're not just putting down keyframes and hoping for the best. At least, you shouldn't be. So anyway, point 2 is not utilizing the 12 principles of animation. Now, you may be all like, wait a minute. I'm not out here trying to be an animator, okay? I'm a motion designer. They're two different things. But you are animating. You may not actually call yourself a 2D or 3D animator. It may not be on your job description, but you are taking things and making them move. So essentially, that is animation. There are certain principles to good-looking animation and movement, and knowing the 12 principles of animation is going to get your stuff looking shit hot. So you need to learn the principles of squash and stretch, anticipation, staging, straight ahead action and pose to pose, follow through and overlapping action, slow in and slow out arcs, secondary action, timing, exaggeration, solid drawing, and appeal. Now, these principles are usually applied to characters, but they can be applied to motion graphics because really they should be applied to anything that is moving. I would say that the most important principles for you to understand as a motion designer would be timing, staging, squash and stretch, slow in and slow out, follow through and overlapping action, anticipation, secondary action, exaggeration, arcs, and appeal. Straight ahead action and pose to pose is also important in terms of how you plan your animation out, how the elements interact with each other, the blocking and the motion paths. But this is obviously not according to a character you're animating, as this would usually be referring to, but rather the animation of the elements that you're working with. Less important out of all of them, I would say, is solid drawing, because obviously solid drawing skills can help you with like perspective and form, and it'll help you strengthen on the design side, but it's not really something that you need to be good at to be a good motion designer. So eventually I will be doing a series on the 12 principles of animation, but I obviously don't have time in this video to actually address and explain each one. So, if you want to find out more about them, you can just go type it into the good old Google and find out 12 principles of animation, or you can wait for my super dope series that I'm going to be doing sometime in the future. So the next mistake you might be making is only using linear keyframes, which is those little diamond looking guys on your timeline, those basic bitches of the keyframe world. They're the standard keyframes you get when you move an object from one point to another with no change in speed or interpolation. They're super mechanical, boring, basic, vanilla. You don't want to use them often at all. Now, you could just change them to easy ease keyframes or different Bezier keyframes, and sometimes that can be okay for your needs, and you can also grab the handles here and adjust the path. Those dots represent the timing while the line is the actual path of motion. Or you can dive into the graph editor, which I highly recommend and is actually my next tip. So some people have progressed past just using the diamond keyframes, but they rely a little too heavily on the keyframe assistant, like using Easy Ease, or they just go in and adjust the path with those little Bezier handles that you see in the composition. But I really strongly suggest that you dive in and get your hands dirty with the graph editor. I get that if you're new, it can be a little bit intimidating, but I've seen people with literally like a year or two under their belts of working in After Effects, and they still don't really use the graph editor. Get in there, separate those dimensions, and show it who's boss. Once you get the hang of it, you'll wonder why it took you so long, and you'll never want to go back. You have way more control and freedom, and I promise you, it will take your motion graphics to the next level. The next mistake is not using motion blur or other ways of conveying fast motion. Now, I'm not saying use motion blur on everything, but it has its place, and its place is very often in your composition. Motion blur can really help with that dynamic, slick, smooth feel. Now, there will be times when motion blur really isn't appropriate for the scene, or it can just make your animation look messy. It just really doesn't work in the situation you have that in. In those cases, you can also use things like smear frames or motion trails to take your motion design from this to this. Now, another huge mistake that I've seen so many times in the 10 years that I've been in this industry, from juniors to students to interns to people with literally just as many years under their belt working in the industry as what I have, and yet they think it's okay to not label their layers, not organize anything, and leave their file a disgusting, bloated mess. Can you tell I take this personally? Like, you must literally hate yourself. Like, you must be a masochist or something if this is how you work, because there's no way that you actually like yourself and respect yourself if you force yourself to work in a situation like that. Get your shit together. This makes me rage so hard, and not in a good way, like when you're going to go to a party with your friends and you're like, let's rage. No, this is the red mist in front of your eyes kind of rage. Make folders for your different assets, like imported artwork in one folder, audio in another, main compositions in their own folder, pre-compositions in another, and any other imported files from other After Effects projects or whatever in its own folder. This is for your own benefit, like just to prevent you having to sift through a bunch of crap, like all these layers and layers of unlabeled stuff, or a bunch of things that you've imported into your project and you don't even know if you're using half of it or even where the audio that you're looking for is anymore. So it's just going to speed things up a lot for you. And what happens if in a year's time you now have to come back to this project and you open it up and you're like, what the hell is going on here? Because you cannot find anything. As well as the fact that usually if you are a professional animator, there's a very high possibility that you're working on a team or somebody else might need to open up and use your file in the future, or if you're collaborating on a project or something. So it really just is in your own best interests and the best interests of your team to keep your file neat and tidy and make sure that it's not bloated. So this brings me to the second part of this issue, which is the bloated files. Do not keep unnecessary stuff in your files. It's just going to slow them down and make the file size really big and make it a lot more difficult to work with. There's a super easy way to debloat your file and just clean it out. All you need to do is go over to File and then Dependencies, and there are a few options there. Collect Files is going to collect all the files in your project into one place. So that's useful if you need to send your files to someone else, but don't do this until you've cleaned it all out and only the necessary stuff is in your file. Consolidate all footage will remove duplicate assets in your project, because sometimes, while you're working, you'll import stuff and sometimes you'll end up with duplicates. So this is really useful to get rid of those. Then there's remove unused footage, which will, remove any footage you haven't used in any comps. Duh. Then there's reduce project, and when you use this, you need to select the folders or compositions that you need to keep in your file and then click on reduce project, and it'll get rid of anything that wasn't in those folders or comps that you had selected. Please love yourself enough to keep an organized project, because you're worth it. Okay, so mistake number 7, I think it's 7. Not using continuously rasterize on vector layers. Guys, come on. That little sun-looking dude, he's your friend. If you're using vector layers in your composition and you want to keep them looking crisp and classy, then please utilize the continuously rasterize button. Otherwise, they will be ugly and pixelated instead of sexy and sharp. Unless you're using the puppet tool on that layer, then shit might get a little janky, but in all other cases, use that little guy. He wants to be used. Mistake number 8 is having static images on screen. So say for instance you have a photo or something on screen, or it's just one image that's sitting there. Don't just have it sitting there. Have even just a slight zoom or something to have a little bit of movement on the screen. Even if the main element has docked and it's there, you can have little motion lines or something around it just to keep, that interest and that dynamic flow going. You should never have anything just completely still on screen. And that brings me on to my next point, which is don't ever have a blank screen. So sometimes you'll have that an element has just animated off. Don't have a blank screen when something's just animated off and something else is about to animate on. Have the second thing follow on from the first thing. People have terrible attention spans these days. Do not show them a blank screen for even a second, because it will scare them off. People need to get their fix of jolts. You want to keep it dynamic, keep it interesting, keep it flowing. As one goes off, you should have the other following behind. You shouldn't have any blank spaces, which is similar to never having anything completely still on screen. And point number 10 is add depth or dimension to your composition. You can do this in a few different ways. You could have depth of field, or you could utilize multiplaning, or you could have a parallax effect. It can be easy to forget these sorts of principles when you're working with 2D layers because you're not thinking about the 3D space of it, but this can really add a lot of dynamism and depth to your composition. So if you have a photo or an image, why not add some interest to it with adding parallax? I know that earlier I suggested adding a slight zoom or something, but how much sicker would it be with parallax? If you've never heard of multiplaning, it's when you've got the foreground, background, and midground on different layers. In 2D, you can convert those layers into 3D and you just spread them out over 3D space so that they're each on a different plane. So when your camera zooms or pans or anything like that, they're moving at different rates and it gives a lot of depth to the composition. You can also manually adjust the rate of movement so that it just is a little bit more exaggerated, but it really adds a lot to your animation and makes it look a lot more interesting and professional. Or as mentioned before, you can just add some depth of field. So for instance, if you've got a bunch of stuff in space, the stuff further away will be a lot more blurred than the stuff closer to the camera. It's really effective if you've got particles, which obviously you use a lot in motion graphics. With stuff like that, depth of field really adds a lot to the composition. So those are the 10 biggest mistakes that I could think of that I've seen motion designers do really often, all the way from absolute juniors to people who've been in the industry for quite a few years. Now, I might think of a few more and do another follow-up video on this. Who knows? I've already committed to doing literally a whole series on the 12 principles of animation, so why not just give myself more work to do? But these are the ones that I could think of for now. I'd love to hear what other pieces of advice you guys could give that maybe I didn't mention here that you see a lot of people doing, or even stuff that you didn't realize before, and when you started doing it, it really took your stuff to the next level. So if you like my videos, you could just tap the like button over there. It doesn't take a lot of effort and it really helps the engagement. And if you really like the video, you could even subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any other videos coming out. I also set up a Patreon because that's a thing that people do. And you can support the channel that way. You get access to behind the scenes, blog posts. I do an animation critique every month for my Patreons, and I'm hoping to set up a really cute little community over there as well. So I hope you guys have a really good rest of the week. Thanks for watching the video. I hope that this can help you just step up your motion design to the next level. Thanks for watching. Love ya. Bye.